The Grand Conclave Chamber on Arcthelis Prime was older than any civilization that still had a name. And on this day it was full. Every seat taken, every holographic balcony lit with the presence of delegates from 412 spacefaring species who had come to decide the fate of the youngest among them. Ambassador Anara Osei stood alone on the central platform, a circle of polished black stone no wider than 10 steps across, surrounded on all sides by rising tiers of alien faces that stretched so high above her they disappeared into shadow. She was the only human in the room, and she knew that every eye and every sensor and every translated whisper was pointed at her. She did not flinch. She had been told what was coming. The vote had been arranged weeks ago, behind closed doors, in meetings she was never invited to. And her sources inside the Kytheran trade delegation had confirmed everything. The coalition had the numbers, and the result was already decided before she had even boarded her shuttle to Arcthelis Prime. But she came anyway, because that is what humans do. High Arbiter Thelin of the Vylori hegemony sat in the tallest seat at the top of the chamber, his long silver face calm and unreadable, his 4 eyes blinking slowly as he opened the session with a voice that carried like a deep bell through the vast hall. He spoke in the old, formal tongue, and the translation systems turned his words into something cold and precise. The Galactic Federated Council convenes today to hear and rule upon Resolution 1178, brought forward by the Vylori hegemony and the Dreth Communion, supported by 214 co-sponsors. The matter concerns the continued membership of the species known as humanity, originating from the star system designated Sol. Anara listened. Her hands were folded behind her back, and her face showed nothing. The charges came next, read aloud by a Dreth legal scholar named Reth Savin, a tall, sharp-featured being with skin like cracked obsidian and eyes that burned a dull orange. His voice was careful and measured, and he laid out each accusation like a stone being placed on a scale. Humanity, he said, had expanded into unclaimed star systems at a rate that violated the spirit of the Federated Expansion Compact. In just 40 years of membership, they had colonized 19 worlds and established permanent stations in 37 systems, a pace that had taken the Dreth over 6,000 years to match. Humanity, he continued, had developed a form of faster-than-light travel that the Council's science advisors had classified as unstable and potentially dangerous to the fabric of local spacetime, a technology they had been asked to abandon and had refused. Humanity, he said with a slight edge to his voice, had been actively spreading their cultural values, individualism, self-governance, personal freedom, to younger species still under the guidance of their elder patrons. And several of those species had begun to reject their patrons entirely, demanding independence in language that sounded unmistakably human. The chamber murmured at each charge, and Anara watched the reactions carefully. The Vylori delegates sat still and satisfied. The Dreth nodded along with sharp jerks of their angular heads, and scattered among the tiers were the species she knew were sympathetic. The Kytherans, the Olari, the small delegation from the Fennec cluster who had always traded fairly with Earth. But sympathy was not enough. It had never been enough. When the charges were finished, High Arbiter Thelin looked down at her from his high seat and asked if the human delegation wished to speak in its defense. Anara stepped forward. "I do," she said, and her voice was steady and clear in the enormous hall. The translation systems carried it to every seat, and for a moment the chamber was perfectly silent. 40 years ago, she began, humanity was invited to join this council. We were told that membership meant partnership, that it meant shared knowledge and mutual protection, and a seat at the table where the future of this galaxy is decided. We accepted that invitation in good faith, and for 40 years we have honored every treaty we signed and kept every promise we made. She paused, and looked up at the tiers of faces above her. The charges against us are not really about expansion rates, or technology classifications, or cultural influence. Every species in this chamber knows that. The charges are about fear. You are afraid of us, and I understand why. A ripple of discomfort moved through the chamber. We are young, Anara continued, and we are fast, and we do not do things the way they have always been done. That frightens you. I cannot make humanity slower, or quieter, or more predictable, because that is not who we are. She took a breath. But I want this council to understand something before it votes. Exile will not make us disappear. It will not make us weaker. And it will not make you safer. It will only prove that this council governs through fear rather than justice. And that is a lesson the galaxy will not forget. The silence that followed was heavy and deep. Then High Arbiter Felon called the vote. It was not close. The holographic tallies filled the air above the chamber. 291 in favor of Exile. 117 against. Resolution 1178 passed. And the sound that followed was not celebration, but a strange, uncertain stillness, as if even those who had voted yes were not entirely sure what they had done. Thelen read the terms in his deep, resonant voice. Humanity was to surrender all FTL gate access codes within 30 standard days. They were to dismantle their 3 off-world embassies and recall all citizens from federated space. A quarantine boundary would be established, a sphere of 50 light-years centered on Sol, and any human vessel found beyond that boundary would be destroyed without warning. Anara listened to every word. When it was finished, Felon looked down at her one final time and asked, as protocol required, if the human delegation accepted the ruling of the council. Anara Ose looked up at him, and for the first time since the session began, she smiled. It was a small smile, thin and knowing, and it reached her dark eyes with something that was not sadness and not anger, but something far more unsettling. The council has made its decision, she said, and her voice carried to every corner of that ancient chamber. Now humanity will make ours. She turned and walked off the platform, her footsteps echoing in the silence, and she did not look back, not once. In his high seat, Felon watched her go. His 4 silver eyes followed her all the way to the great doors, and when they closed behind her he sat very still for a long time. He had led the Vylori hegemony for 300 years. He had overseen treaties and wars and the rise and fall of civilizations. He had never once doubted a decision made from this chair. But as the doors sealed shut and the murmur of the chamber rose around him like a tide, he felt something cold move through his chest, something he had not felt in centuries. It was doubt, and beside it, quiet and persistent, was something worse. It was fear. Rat Savan noticed it too, though he said nothing. He simply gathered his documents and looked once more at the sealed doors where the human ambassador had disappeared, and he thought to himself that there was something deeply wrong about a species that received a death sentence and responded with a smile. The other delegates filed out slowly, talking in low voices, and by the time the chamber was empty, the lights had dimmed to their resting glow, and the great hall was silent again, silent the way it had been for thousands of years before humanity had ever set foot in it. But something had changed. The air itself felt different, as if the room remembered what had been said and was holding it close, turning it over, waiting to see what would come next. And far away, on a blue and green world orbiting a small yellow star, the lights in every government building on the planet burned through the night as humanity began to plan. 8 years had passed since the vote, and the galaxy had done its best to forget about Earth. In the halls of the Galactic Federated Council, humanity's name came up less and less. The Vylori delegates sometimes mentioned the Exile as a success story during policy debates, pointing to it as proof that the Council could act decisively when a species threatened the natural order of things. The Dreth Communion used it as a warning to younger species who pushed too hard or asked too many questions. And the rest of the galaxy simply moved on with its business, filling the space humanity had left the way water fills a hole in sand. Counselor Ref Savan was one of the few who had not moved on. He sat in his private office aboard monitoring station Krev 7, one of the 12 stations positioned along the quarantine boundary, a ring of sensors and weapons platforms that marked the edge of the 50-light-year sphere centered on Sol, beyond which no human ship was permitted to travel. His job was to watch that boundary, to catalog any signal or movement that came from inside, and to report his findings to the Council every 30 days. For the first 3 years, there had been plenty to report. Human radio signals leaked out constantly. News broadcasts, entertainment channels, military chatter, the ordinary electromagnetic noise of a busy civilization going about its life behind a wall it had not chosen. Reth had listened to it all, had cataloged it all, and had included it all in his reports with the quiet satisfaction of a man who believed he had done the right thing. Then the signals began to fade. It happened slowly at first, a few frequencies going silent here, a reduction in broadcast power there, and Reth assumed it was simply the natural result of a civilization turning inward, cutting back on expensive long-range transmissions, now that there was nobody out there to talk to. But by year 5, the silence was almost total. By year 7, it was complete. No radio signals, no electromagnetic bleed, no subspace noise, no infrared signatures from orbital stations, nothing. The entire 50-light-year sphere had gone dark. Reached inside and turned off every light and every voice all at once. Reth filed his reports and requested additional sensor sweeps. The Council approved them without much interest, and the sweeps came back empty. There was nothing to detect, nothing to analyze, nothing to report. He brought his concerns to High Arbiter Thelen during a routine briefing, and Thelen listened politely, and then dismissed them with a wave of one long silver hand. "They have collapsed," Thelen said in his calm, certain voice. "Cut off from galactic trade, cut off from the gate network, cut off from the shared knowledge base. They had no choice but to regress. This is what happens to a species that refuses to respect the order of things. They burn bright, and then they burn out." Reth wanted to believe that. He truly did. But late at night, alone in his office with the sensor displays glowing in the dark around him, he could not shake the feeling that silence and weakness were not the same thing. A species that made no noise might be a species that had nothing left to say, but it might also be a species that had learned to be quiet on purpose. And the humans he had studied, the ones he had watched during the 40 years of their membership, the ones he had argued against in council debates, they had never been the type to go quietly. Inside the quarantine boundary, behind the wall of silence that Reth could not penetrate, something extraordinary was happening. The collapse that the council expected had never come. Not even close. Within 6 months of the exile, every human colony and every faction on Earth itself had signed a single document called the Prometheus Compact. And it was unlike anything humanity had ever agreed upon before. The compact was simple. It stated that exile was not a punishment, but a liberation. That the Council's technology had always been shared on terms designed to keep younger species dependent, and that humanity would now build everything it needed from scratch, on its own terms, with no limits and no permission required. And they meant it. The first 3 years were hard, brutal even. Without access to the FTL gate network, the colonies were isolated from each other, and trade routes that had run through federated space were gone overnight. Shortages hit several outer colonies, and on Earth itself there were protests and fear and the kind of anger that comes from being told you are not welcome in a place you had called home. But humans had always been at their most dangerous when they were cornered. The scientists moved first, free from the Council's technology-sharing agreements, agreements that came with thousands of restrictions on what could and could not be researched. They dove into the very fields the Council had forbidden. Within 2 years, they had cracked the theoretical framework for a new kind of faster-than-light travel. One that did not require gates or infrastructure or any of the massive anchor stations the Council used. They called it the Reality Fold Drive. And it worked by folding space itself around a vessel, moving it from one point to another without ever technically traveling the distance between them. It left no energy signature. A ship using it could appear anywhere and disappear again before a sensor could register it had been there at all. By year 4, the first prototype was flying. By year 6, every human warship had one, and the shipyards, hidden deep in the outer reaches of the Sol system, tucked behind the gas giants and buried inside hollowed asteroids, were building vessels at a pace that would have made the Council's military planners weep. Not just warships, but carriers and research stations, and things that had no name yet because no one had ever built anything like them before. The project that consumed the most resources was known only as Longhand, and fewer than 1,000 people in all of human space knew what it actually was. It was run from a facility buried under the ice of Europa, and it had something to do with a threat that human deep space sensors had detected in year 3. A threat that was still far away, but moving closer. A threat the Council had not yet noticed, because their sensors were not looking in the right direction. A new philosophy took hold among the human colonies during those years. A quiet, steady belief that spread from person to person and world to world until it became something like a creed. We were guests in their house. Now we build our own. Not everyone outside the boundary had forgotten about humanity. A Kytheran trader named Solvin ran cargo routes along the outer edges of Federated space, close enough to the quarantine boundary that she could sometimes feel the emptiness of it pressing against her ship's sensors. The Kytherans had voted against Exile, all of them, without exception, and Solvin carried that vote like a badge of honor. She also carried something else, small data packets hidden inside her cargo manifests, cultural files, and news archives and scientific journals from the wider galaxy, smuggled to a human outpost on the edge of the boundary through a gap in the sensor net that she had found by accident and maintained by skill. Every few months, she would dock at the outpost, hand over the data, and spend a few hours talking with the humans there. They were always polite, always grateful, and always busy. She noticed that none of them seemed broken or desperate or defeated. They moved with purpose. They spoke about the future with a confidence that startled her, and they asked questions about the galaxy outside with the calm curiosity of people who expected to see it again someday. "You are not what I expected," she told a young human engineer once, a woman named Priya, who worked on the outpost's communication systems. Priya had smiled at that, a warm, easy smile that made Solvin think of sunlight, though she had never seen a sun like Earth's. "What did you expect?" Priya asked. "Anger," Solvin said. "Bitterness. Despair, perhaps." Priya shook her head. "We do not have time for despair. We have too much to build." That answer stayed with Solvin for a long time. It stayed with her on the long cargo runs and the quiet nights in deep space. And it made her wonder what exactly humanity was building behind that wall of silence. On monitoring station Krev 7, Rhett Savan was wondering the same thing. He had stopped filing optimistic reports. He no longer told the Council that the silence meant collapse. Instead, he wrote careful, measured analyses that said the same thing in different ways. That the absence of information was not the same as the absence of activity, and that a species as resourceful as humanity did not simply stop making noise unless it had a very good reason to be quiet. The Council read his reports and did nothing. Then, on a night like any other, a signal broke through the boundary. It was brief, barely 3 seconds, and it was not a distress call. It was not a request for contact. It was a single transmission, tight and precise, broadcast on a frequency that cut through every jamming system the monitoring stations had. It was a message, and it was written in 4,000 languages, every language the Council had on record. Reth read it on his display, and the orange glow of his eyes dimmed as the words settled into his mind. "We remember who voted, and how," that was all it said. He sat there for a very long time after that, alone in the dark, with those 6 words hanging in the air, and he realized with a cold, crawling certainty that the galaxy had made a terrible mistake. The humans had not collapsed. They had not gone quiet because they had nothing left. They had gone quiet because they were getting ready. 15 years after the Exile, the galaxy learned what fear really looked like. It began in the outer spiral, a region of space so far from the core worlds that most species had never even mapped it. A Valori survey fleet was conducting routine mineral scans when their long-range sensors picked up something massive moving through the void between stars. Something that should not have been there. They sent a probe, and the probe sent back 12 seconds of data before it stopped transmitting. 12 seconds was enough. The Xenovari swarm had returned. Every spacefaring species knew the name, though most had only read about it in ancient records and half-forgotten histories. The swarm was not a civilization, and not an army. It was a living thing, a superorganism of impossible size, a network of billions of interconnected bioforms that moved through the galaxy like a slow tide of hunger, consuming everything in its path. Worlds, stations, ships, even stars if given enough time. It emerged roughly every 10,000 years, fed until nothing was left, and then retreated into the deep void to sleep and grow and wait for the next cycle. But this cycle had come early, thousands of years ahead of schedule, and the swarm was larger than any record had ever described. The first system fell in 6 days. The Valori survey fleet was consumed in hours, their distress signals cut short as the swarm's bioforms swarmed over their ships and broke them apart molecule by molecule. The Council responded with a battle group, 40 warships from 3 different species, and the battle group lasted 9 days before the last ship was destroyed. The swarm adapted. That was the horror of it. Every weapon used against it was studied and countered within hours. Energy weapons were absorbed, kinetic weapons were deflected by rapidly grown armor plating, and biological agents were metabolized and turned into fuel. The Council's military commanders had never faced an enemy that learned faster than they could invent. 3 homeworlds fell in the first 2 months, the Pelori, the Cephine, and the Graven Reach, each one stripped of life so completely that the planets themselves were left as gray, barren husks drifting in dead orbits. Panic spread through the Federated Council like fire through dry grass. Emergency sessions ran day and night, and species that had not spoken to each other in centuries were suddenly sharing fleet coordinates and weapons data in desperate attempts to slow the swarm's advance. Nothing worked. High Arbiter Thelen stood before the Council on the 93rd day of the invasion and spoke words that every delegate had been thinking, but none had dared to say aloud. "We need the humans." The chamber erupted. The Valori delegation protested. How could the High Arbiter suggest crawling back to the very species they had cast out? The Dreth argued that humanity had surely collapsed and could offer nothing. A dozen smaller delegations shouted over each other about pride and protocol and the danger of admitting weakness. But Thelen silenced them all with a single raised hand. "Pride," he said, "will not stop the swarm. Protocol will not rebuild our lost worlds. I authored Resolution 1178, and I stand by the reasoning that led to it. But reasoning means nothing if we are all dead." The Council authorized a diplomatic mission across the quarantine boundary by a vote of 380 to 29. It was the fastest vote in the history of the Federated Council. A single Valori diplomatic cruiser crossed the boundary 3 days later, carrying a crew of 40 and a formal request for aid written in the most respectful language the Council scholars could produce. They found nothing. The space inside the boundary was empty. No stations where the old maps showed stations. No colonies where colonies had been. No signals. No ships. No debris. Nothing at all. The Sol system itself was invisible, hidden behind some kind of masking field that the Valori crew's instruments could not even begin to analyze. Their sensors showed empty space where Earth's sun should have been, as if someone had erased an entire star system from the universe. The crew was frightened, and they had every right to be. Then the ships appeared. They did not fly in from a distance, or emerge from behind cover. They were simply there, as if reality itself had folded open and let them through. One moment the diplomatic cruiser was alone in empty space, and the next moment it was surrounded by a fleet so large that the sensor display could not count them all. Thousands of ships, sleek, angular, built from materials the Valori had never seen, running on energy signatures their instruments could not identify. They hung in formation around the diplomatic cruiser, like a school of predators around a single small fish, silent and still and waiting. A transmission came through on all frequencies, and the voice that spoke was calm, professional, and utterly without fear. "This is Admiral Darius Wren of the Terran Defense Fleet. You have entered sovereign human space. Identify yourselves and state your purpose." The Valori captain stammered through an introduction, and delivered the Council's formal request for aid against the Xenovari swarm. There was a pause, a long, deliberate pause, and then Admiral Wren spoke again. "We are aware of the swarm. We have been tracking its movements for 7 years. We know where it is. We know how fast it is growing, and we know how to stop it. But we have terms." The transmission that followed was not directed at the diplomatic cruiser. It was broadcast directly into the Grand Conclave Chamber on Arcthelus Prime, cutting through every security protocol and every firewall the Council had, appearing on every screen and every speaker as if the entire communication network of the Federated Council was made of paper. Admiral Wren's face filled the chamber, a human face, weathered and sharp, with dark eyes that held no hatred but also no deference. And he spoke to 412 species at once. 15 years ago, this council voted to cast humanity into the dark. You took our gate access, you sealed our borders, and you told us that any ship we sent beyond the boundary would be destroyed. We accepted your terms because we had no choice. Now you come to us because you have no choice, and we will help you, but not as subjects, not as petitioners, and not as the species you tried to erase. He laid out 5 conditions. First, exile was over, permanently, and humanity would never again submit to the authority of the Federated Council. Second, the quarantine boundary was dissolved immediately, and human ships would travel wherever they chose. Third, a new agreement called the Terran Accord would be drawn up, establishing humanity not as a member beneath the Council, but as a sovereign equal alongside it. Fourth, every species that voted for exile would formally acknowledge their error, not as punishment, but as precedent, so that no young species would ever be cast out again. And fifth, he paused here, and something changed in his eyes, something that was not anger, but was just as dangerous. We want Seat 0. Seat 0 was the empty chair at the center of the council chamber, the oldest symbol of the Federated Council, never occupied, representing the principle that no single species should lead. It had sat empty for longer than most civilizations had existed. "We are not asking to sit in it," Wren said. "We are asking you to remove it, because the idea that leadership must be an empty chair is a lie. The galaxy does not need a symbol of absent leadership. It needs actual leadership, and it needs the courage to share it." The transmission ended. The chamber sat in stunned, airless silence. 412 species stared at the blank screens where a human admiral had just rewritten the political architecture of the galaxy in under 5 minutes. High Arbiter Thelen sat in his tall seat with his 4 silver eyes wide, and his long hands gripping the armrests, and he said nothing for a very long time. In his monitoring station on the boundary, Reth Savin watched a replay of the transmission, and when it was finished, he leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling and whispered a single question into the empty room. What have we created? Outside, beyond the walls of every station and every ship and every world that still stood, the swarm was coming, vast and hungry and unstoppable by any force the galaxy had ever known. And somewhere behind a wall of silence that had just been torn open, 10,000 human warships were already moving. The war against the Xenovari swarm began not with a grand battle, but with a silence. A different kind of silence from the one humanity had kept for 15 years. This was the silence of a blade being drawn. Admiral Darius Wren stood on the command deck of the TSS Prometheus, the flagship of the Terran Defense Fleet, and watched the tactical display paint the galaxy in shades of red and gold. Red for the swarm's advance, gold for every world that still had people on it. There was far more red than gold, and every hour the balance shifted further. He had been preparing for this moment for almost a decade. His engineers had built the ships, his scientists had built the weapons, and his intelligence teams had mapped the swarm's movements with a precision that the Council's best minds could not match, because humanity had known the swarm was coming long before the Council did. Their deep space sensors, built during the quiet years without anyone's permission or knowledge, had detected the first stirrings of the swarm 7 years ago, and every day since then had been spent getting ready. All fleet groups report status, Wren said into the command channel, and one by one the responses came in. 12 fleet groups, each consisting of over 800 warships, spread across a front that spanned 300 light-years. Behind them, in reserve, were the heavy carriers and the weapons platforms and the ships that carried the things humanity had built in the dark, the things the galaxy had never seen. The Council had sent observers, military advisors from 7 different species who were supposed to coordinate joint operations between the human fleet and the remains of the Council's navy. They stood at the edge of the command deck and tried not to look as overwhelmed as they felt. A Valori officer named Kale watched the tactical display and could not understand what he was seeing. The human fleet was not formed into the defensive lines and layered formations that Council military doctrine required. Instead, they were arranged in loose fluid clusters that seemed to shift and flow like living things, and the movement patterns made no sense to him at all. "Your formations are wrong," he said to a human tactical officer, a young woman with short hair and calm eyes. She looked at him with an expression that was not unkind, but was not interested in his opinion either. "They are not formations," she said. "They are hunting patterns." The first engagement came at the Verasi system, where a swarm tendril had been consuming the outer planets for 3 days. Council ships had tried to hold the line and had been pushed back repeatedly, losing a dozen vessels to the swarm's adaptive defenses. The human fleet arrived without warning. One moment, the space around Verasi was filled with swarm bioforms and the burning hulks of Council warships, and the next moment, 200 human ships were there. They had not jumped in from FTL, had not decelerated from high speed, had simply appeared as if reality had opened a door and they had walked through it. The reality-fold drives left no signature, no flash of light, no energy wake. The ships were just suddenly present, already in attack position, already firing. The weapons they used were unlike anything the Council had ever developed. They did not fire energy beams or kinetic rounds. Instead, they launched something the human crews called adaptive munitions, small, fast projectiles that carried onboard processing systems, capable of analyzing a target's defenses in real time, and restructuring their own attack method mid-flight. If the swarm grew armor, the munitions shifted to a frequency that passed through it. If the swarm absorbed energy, the munitions switched to physical penetration. If the swarm tried to metabolize the munitions themselves, the munitions released payloads that were toxic to the swarm's specific biology. The swarm adapted, because that is what it did, but for the first time in its existence, the thing it was fighting adapted faster. The Battle of Varasi lasted 4 hours, and when it was over, the swarm tendril had been reduced to drifting clouds of dead biomass, and not a single human ship had been destroyed. The Council observers stood on the command deck of the Prometheus and said nothing. They had just watched a force do in 4 hours what the combined fleets of the Federated Council had failed to do in 3 months, and they did not have words for what they were feeling. The war continued, and with each engagement the pattern repeated, human fleets appearing from nowhere, striking with terrible precision, and vanishing before the swarm could mount a coordinated response. System after system was cleared, and the red on the tactical display began to shrink. But it was not clean, and it was not without cost. At the Battle of Tesserin, a swarm hive cluster ambushed a human fleet group that had folded into the system, expecting a smaller force. 67 human ships were lost in the first 10 minutes, and Admiral Wren had to order 3 additional fleet groups to fold in as reinforcements before the cluster was destroyed. The crews of those 67 ships, over 18,000 men and women, were gone, consumed by the swarm so quickly that there was nothing left to recover. Wren read the casualty reports in his quarters that night, alone, and he read every name. He was a man shaped by exile. His parents had been diplomats, his mother had served on the Council's Cultural Exchange Committee, and his father had been a legal advisor to the human embassy on Arcthelus Prime. He had been 12 years old when Resolution 1178 was passed, and he remembered the day his family had been escorted off the station. His mother weeping quietly, his father holding her hand with a face like stone, and the alien security officers who would not meet their eyes. He did not hate the aliens. He had decided that long ago, deliberately and with effort, because hatred was heavy, and he needed to be light. But he remembered everything, and memory was a different kind of weight, one that sharpened rather than slowed. The most feared weapon in humanity's arsenal was deployed for the first time at the Battle of Keth Valar, a Dreth homeworld with a population of 9 billion that was about to be overrun. It was called a Hearthfire device, and it worked by igniting the specific atomic bonds that held the swarm's biomass together. When detonated, it created a chain reaction that spread through every connected swarm bioform within range, burning them from the inside out. The effect was devastating. An entire planetary invasion force reduced to ash in seconds. The sky above Keth Valar turning orange and then white, and then clear, as billions of swarm organisms died at once. The Dreth who watched from their shelters below did not know whether to cheer or weep. The weapon that had saved them was so powerful and so precise and so terrible that it made them realize, with a clarity that cut like a blade, exactly how far humanity had advanced during those 15 quiet years. Counselor Reth Savin was on Keth Valar when it happened. He had come to oversee the evacuation, and he had stayed when the evacuation had failed, and he had been in a bunker with 2,000 Dreth civilians when the Hearthfire detonation had turned the sky to fire. When it was over, when the all-clear signal came, and the bunker doors opened, and the survivors walked out into air that smelled like burnt copper, Reth looked up and saw human shuttles descending through the clearing smoke. Medical teams, engineers, supply carriers, everything a shattered world needed to survive the next few days. He found Admiral Wren on a landing pad near the central city, directing the deployment of field hospitals and water purification units. The Admiral looked tired, not exhausted, but worn, in the way that a blade gets worn, thinner and sharper with use. "Admiral," Reth said, and his voice was rough with ash and gratitude, "I want to thank you, on behalf of the Dreth Communion and the people of Keth Valar. I want to—" "We did not come for you," Ren said, and his voice was quiet but clear. He looked at Reth with dark eyes that held no anger and no warmth and no judgment, only a steady, unshakable calm. "We came because there were children on this world. That is the difference between us." Reth stood there and felt those words settle into him like stones dropping into deep water, and he had nothing to say in return, nothing at all. Elsewhere in the fleet, Solvin the Kytheran trader had found a new purpose. She had joined a joint human-alien crew, running supply convoys to liberated systems. And every day she saw things that she would later write about in the account that would change the galaxy. She saw human soldiers sitting in cargo bays after battle, cleaning their equipment in silence, and then one of them would start singing. Not a war song, but something soft and old, something from Earth, and the others would join in one by one, until the whole bay was full of voices. She saw a human medic treat a wounded Valori officer, the same species that had authored the Exile, with the same care and the same urgency as she would treat one of her own. She saw a human engineer spend 14 hours repairing the life support system of a Dreth refugee transport, refusing to sleep until every compartment had clean air. And when a Dreth elder tried to thank him, he just shrugged and said, "It is what we do." And she realized something that made her chest ache with a feeling she didn't expect. Could not name. The Council had exiled humanity because they were afraid of what humans could become. They should have been afraid of what they already were. The final battle came in the deep void between stars, where the swarm's core hive mind, the central intelligence that coordinated all of its billions of bioforms, had been located by human deep space scouts. It was massive, a living structure the size of a small moon, pulsing with bioluminescent light in the darkness. Admiral Ren led the assault personally. 3 fleet groups folded into the void around the hive mind and opened fire with everything they had: adaptive munitions, hearthfire devices, and weapons that had no name yet, because they had been built for this one target and this one moment. The battle lasted 11 hours. The swarm fought with desperate animal fury, throwing everything it had at the human ships in waves that seemed endless. But humanity did not break, did not retreat, did not stop. When the hive mind finally died, it died in fire, a hearthfire detonation so large that it lit up the void like a temporary star, and every swarm bioform in the galaxy shuddered and went still and began to drift. The war was over, and now, with no enemy left to fight, every species in the galaxy turned to look at humanity and wondered what came next. The conference was held on Earth. That was the first thing the Council had to accept, and it was not easy. For 15 years, Earth had been the place beyond the wall, the silent, invisible world that the galaxy had tried to forget. Now delegates from 390 species were descending through its atmosphere in shuttles and transports, looking out their windows at blue oceans and green continents and white clouds, and many of them were seeing a living, breathing world for the first time in their lives. Their own homeworlds were old, their biospheres carefully managed or long since replaced by technology, and Earth's raw, unfiltered beauty struck them with a force they had not expected. The conference hall had been built in Geneva, on the shore of a lake that reflected the mountains behind it like a mirror. It was not as grand as the conclave chamber on Arkfelis Prime. It was smaller, simpler, built from stone and glass and wood in a style that was unmistakably human. But it had windows, enormous windows, that looked out over the water and the sky. And the alien delegates who entered it understood immediately that this was a deliberate choice. The Council's chamber was ancient and dark and enclosed, designed to make those inside feel the weight of tradition and authority. This hall was open and bright, designed to make those inside feel the world around them. Ambassador Anara Osei stood at the entrance and greeted every delegation personally. She was older now, 15 years older, and her hair had gone silver at the temples, and her face carried lines that had not been there before. But her eyes were the same, dark and steady and sharp. And when she shook hands, or pressed palms, or performed whatever greeting each species required, she did it with a warmth that surprised many of them. She had spent 15 years waiting for this day, and she was not going to waste it on bitterness. The negotiations took 11 days. They were difficult, not because humanity was unreasonable, but because the changes being proposed were so fundamental that many species struggled to accept them. The Galactic Federated Council had operated on the same principles for tens of thousands of years. Elder species guided younger ones. Influence was proportional to age and technological advancement. And the structures of power were layered and complex and deeply resistant to change. Humanity wanted to tear all of it down. Admiral Darius Wren served as humanity's senior envoy during the negotiations, and he was a strange figure at the conference table, a military commander in a room full of diplomats, a man who had just won a war, being asked to build a peace. But he was calm and precise and patient in a way that unnerved the alien delegates because they expected demands and threats and received instead carefully reasoned arguments, delivered in a quiet voice. "We are not asking for power," he said on the third day, when the Violori delegation accused humanity of trying to replace one hierarchy with another. "We are asking for the absence of power. No species above another, no elder privilege, no patron systems. One species, one vote, that is all." The Valori protested. Their civilization was 40,000 years old. Surely that experience counted for something. "It does," Wren said. "It counts as experience, not as authority. You can advise, you can share, you can teach, but you cannot rule. That is the difference, and it is the only difference that matters." Day by day, clause by clause, the Terran Accord took shape. The restructuring of the Council was the centerpiece. Every species would have one vote, regardless of age or size or technological level. The elder species privileges that had allowed the Valori and the Dreth and a handful of other old civilizations to effectively control the Council for millennia were abolished. The patron system, under which younger species were assigned to elder guardians who controlled their development, and the quarantine doctrine, the legal framework that had allowed the Council to exile humanity, was formally declared a crime against sentient development, never to be invoked again. It was this last point that caused the most emotion. When the clause was read aloud in the conference hall, several delegates from species that had themselves been threatened with exile in centuries past rose to their feet in silence. They did not speak, did not applaud, simply stood, and the weight of that standing was heavier than any words could have been. A matter of seat 0 was settled on the 9th day. The empty chair at the center of the old council chamber had been a symbol for as long as anyone could remember. The idea that no species should lead, that the center must remain vacant, that power was safest when it belonged to no one. Humanity argued that this was not wisdom but cowardice, that an empty chair did not prevent tyranny but simply disguised it, allowing the most powerful species to lead from behind, while pretending the center was empty. The chair would be removed. In its place, a simple plaque would be installed, written in every known language, present and extinct, bearing a single sentence: "No species shall be cast out for the sin of growing too fast." When the final text of the Terran Accord was presented for ratification on the 11th day, 387 species voted in favor, 3 voted against, 2 abstained. It was done. The ceremony that followed was quiet. Humanity had insisted on that. No grand celebrations, no victory parades, no displays of military power. Instead, there was a reception in the conference hall, with food and drink from 100 worlds, and the delegates mingled and talked, and began the slow, awkward process of learning to see each other as equals. High Arbiter Felon attended, though he had already announced his resignation. He moved through the reception like a ghost, his tall silver figure drawing looks from every corner of the room. When he found Ambassador Osei standing by one of the great windows, looking out at the lake, he stopped beside her and stood in silence for a long time. "You knew," he said finally, "on the day of the vote, when you smiled and walked out, you already knew what would happen." Inara looked at him. "No," she said, "I did not know what would happen. I only knew what would not happen. We would not break, and we would not beg. Everything else we built as we went." Felon's 4 eyes blinked slowly. "I have governed for 300 years, he said. "I have never been wrong about a species before." "You were not wrong about us," Inara said. "You were afraid of us, and you were right to be. But fear is not a reason to exile someone. It is a reason to know them better." Felon gave his final address to the assembled delegates that evening. It was short, and it was honest, and it was the hardest thing he had ever done. The exile of humanity, he said, was born not of justice, but of fear. We saw a species that grew too fast, that questioned too much, that refused to follow the path we had laid for them, and we were afraid, not of what they might do to us, but of what their example might do to the order we had spent millennia building. We were wrong. The order was not worth protecting, and the species we cast out proved it. Not by conquering us, not by punishing us, but by saving us, and then asking only for fairness in return. I do not know if that is forgiveness. I think it may be something harder. He stepped down from the podium and walked out of the hall, and no one tried to stop him. Reth Savin found Admiral Wren later that night, standing outside the conference hall in the cool air, looking up at the stars. The Dreth counselor had spent the last several weeks wrestling with something, and he could not carry it any longer. "Admiral," he said, and Wren turned to look at him. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly." "Ask," Wren said. "Will humanity ever forgive us?" Wren looked at him for a long time, not with anger, not with coldness, but with the steady, clear gaze of a man who had thought about this question many times and had found an answer that satisfied him. "Forgiveness is not the point," he said. "Memory is. We will remember, and because we remember, we will make sure it never happens again." Reth nodded slowly, and something in his chest loosened. Not relief exactly, but acceptance. He understood. Solvin published her account of the exile and the war 3 months later. She called it The Species That Came Back, and it spread across the galaxy faster than any document in recorded history. It was translated into every language, taught in every school, and read by billions of beings who had never met a human, but who, after reading it, felt that they understood something important about the universe they lived in. It was not a story about war or politics or technology. It was a story about a people who were told they did not belong, and who responded by becoming indispensable. Not through force, but through character. Not through conquest, but through refusal to become what their enemies expected them to be. On the night the accord was signed, long after the delegates had returned to their ships, and the conference hall had gone dark, a street musician sat on a bench in the old quarter of Geneva and played a violin. The notes drifted up through the narrow streets and over the rooftops and into the cold night air. And a Kitharan child, a refugee from the war, one of thousands that Earth had taken in, sat on the steps nearby and listened with wide, luminous eyes. The music was old, older than spaceflight, older than the wars, older than almost anything humanity had built, and it carried in it something that could not be translated or explained or reduced to data. It carried the sound of a species that had been knocked down more times than it could count, and had stood up every single time. Above the city, past the atmosphere, past the orbit of the moon, 10,000 human ships hung in the dark, silent, watchful, patient. They were not there to threaten or to guard or to remind anyone of what humanity could do. They were simply there, the way a heartbeat is there, steady and constant and alive. The galaxy had tried to make humanity small. It had failed. Not because humanity was mighty, though it was. Not because humanity was clever, though it was that too. It had failed because you cannot exile a species that carries its home inside its chest. You cannot silence a people whose defiance is sung, not shouted. The Council had cast Earth into the dark, and in the dark, humanity had learned to shine.